Lady Isabella Thornfield stood at the grand window of Ravenshollow Manor, watching the morning mist roll across the emerald grounds. At 25, she possessed the kind of beauty that made men stumble over their words and women whisper behind their fans. Her raven-black hair cascaded down her back like silk, and her emerald eyes held secrets that no one had ever dared to uncover. But beneath her perfect exterior lay a heart that yearned for something more than the gilded cage of aristocratic life. The manor had been her prison for 3 years now, ever since her marriage to Lord Edmund Thornfield, a man 30 years her senior, who collected beautiful things the way other men collected hunting trophies. Edmund was kind enough in his distant way, but their marriage was as cold as the marble floors that echoed through the endless corridors of their home. He spent his days buried in ledgers and land disputes, treating Isabella more like an expensive ornament than a wife. That morning was different, though. Isabella had received word that a new head gardener would be arriving to tend to the estate's vast gardens. The previous gardener, old Mr. Weatherby, had passed away the month before, leaving the once magnificent gardens to grow wild and untamed. Isabella had always found solace among the roses and lavender, and the thought of having someone restore their beauty filled her with an excitement she hadn't felt in years. As she descended the grand staircase, her silk gown rustling against the polished mahogany banister, Isabella caught sight of a figure through the French doors that led to the garden terrace. The man was tall and broad-shouldered, his dark hair catching the morning sunlight as he surveyed the overgrown rose garden with an expert eye. Even from a distance, there was something about the way he moved that spoke of strength and confidence, so different from the soft, pampered men of her social circle. Mrs. Hawthorne, the head housekeeper, appeared at Isabella's elbow with her usual efficiency. The older woman had been with the Thornfield family for decades and knew every secret the manor walls held. "That would be the new gardener, my lady," she said, following Isabella's gaze. "Mr. James Blackwood. Comes highly recommended from the Ashworth estate up north. They say he can make flowers bloom in winter and turn barren ground into paradise." Isabella found herself unable to look away as James knelt beside a struggling rosebush, his hands gentle as he examined its withered stems. There was something almost reverent in the way he touched the plants, as if he could sense their pain and promise of renewal. She had never seen anyone approach gardening with such passion and care. "Lord Thornfield has given him free rein over the entire grounds," Mrs. Hawthorne continued, though she noticed the way her mistress's eyes lingered on the gardener. "He'll be staying in the cottage by the east gate. Quite the departure from our usual staff arrangements, but his lordship was most insistent." The cottage by the east gate was isolated from the main house, hidden behind a grove of ancient oak trees. It had been empty for years, serving only to house visiting dignitaries who preferred privacy to the grandeur of the main manor. The thought of James living there, so close yet so separate from her world, sent an unexpected flutter through Isabella's chest. As if sensing her gaze, James suddenly looked up toward the house. Even across the distance, Isabella felt the intensity of his dark eyes as they met hers through the glass. For a moment that seemed to stretch into eternity, neither looked away. His face was weathered by sun and honest work, with strong features that spoke of character rather than privilege. There was something wild and untamed about him, like the gardens he had come to restore. Isabella's heart began to race in a way that had nothing to do with her morning walk. She pressed her palm against the cool glass, feeling suddenly breathless. James stood slowly, never breaking eye contact, and touched the brim of his hat in a gesture that was both respectful and somehow intimate. The simple acknowledgement sent warmth flooding through her body. "My lady?" Mrs. Hawthorne's voice seemed to come from very far away. "Are you quite well? You look rather flushed." Isabella forced herself to step back from the window, her cheeks burning with embarrassment at being caught staring. "I'm perfectly fine," she managed, though her voice sounded strangely breathless even to her own ears. "I was simply curious about the new arrangements for the garden." But even as she spoke the polite words, Isabella knew that something fundamental had shifted in that moment of connection with the mysterious gardener. For the first time in years, she felt truly alive, as if she had been sleepwalking through her existence and had suddenly awakened to find the world full of color and possibility. That evening, as she sat through another silent dinner with Edmund, Isabella found her thoughts drifting constantly to the cottage by the east gate. She wondered what James was doing, whether he was thinking about the gardens or perhaps about her. The thought was both thrilling and terrifying, awakening desires she had thought buried forever beneath the weight of duty and propriety. Little did she know that in the cottage beyond the oak trees, James Blackwood was indeed thinking of her, remembering the way the morning light had caught in her dark hair and the startled beauty of her emerald eyes. He had taken the position at Ravenshollow Manor to escape his own complicated past. But one look at Lady Isabella Thornfield had told him that his troubles were far from over. 3 days had passed since James Blackwood's arrival, and Isabella found herself creating excuses to walk through the gardens. She told herself it was merely to oversee the restoration work, but deep down she knew the truth. Every morning she would dress carefully in her finest day gowns and make her way to the garden paths, hoping for another glimpse of the mysterious gardener who had captured her thoughts so completely. James had thrown himself into his work with remarkable dedication. Already the difference was visible throughout the grounds. Dead branches had been cleared away, overgrown hedges trimmed back to reveal their elegant shapes, and the flower beds weeded and prepared for new plantings. He worked from dawn until dusk, his shirt often damp with perspiration as he labored under the summer sun. On the 4th morning, Isabella's carefully planned garden walk finally paid off. She rounded the corner of the rose garden to find James kneeling beside the fountain, carefully replanting white lilies around its base. The sight of him so close made her pulse quicken, and she found herself studying the way his dark hair fell across his forehead as he concentrated on his work. "Good morning." "Mr. Blackwood," she said, surprised at how steady her voice sounded despite the chaos in her chest. James looked up, squinting slightly in the bright sunlight, and quickly got to his feet. There was dirt on his hands and a smudge of earth across his cheek, but somehow it only made him more attractive. "Good morning, Lady Thornfield," he replied, touching his hat respectfully. "I hope my work isn't disturbing you. I know the noise of the restoration can be quite loud." "Not at all," Isabella assured him, stepping closer to examine the newly planted lilies. "In fact, I'm amazed by how much you've accomplished in such a short time. The gardens already look more beautiful than they have in months." A smile tugged at the corner of James's mouth, transforming his serious expression into something warmer and more approachable. "Gardens are like people, my lady. They just need someone to believe in their potential and give them the care they deserve." The comment seemed loaded with meaning, and Isabella felt her cheeks flush as she wondered if he was speaking about more than just flowers. Standing so close to him, she could smell the earthy scent of soil and growing things that clung to his clothes, mixed with something else that was uniquely him. It was intoxicating in a way that the expensive cologne worn by men of her social class had never been. "I've always loved these gardens," she admitted, kneeling beside the fountain to trail her fingers in the cool water. "When I was a child visiting here, I used to imagine they were enchanted. I thought if I could find the secret heart of the garden, it would grant me any wish I desired." James knelt beside her, careful to maintain a respectful distance, but close enough that she could feel the warmth radiating from his body. "And what would you have wished for?" he asked quietly. The question hung in the air between them, heavy with possibilities. Isabella found herself studying his face, noting the way his dark eyes seemed to see right through all her carefully constructed defenses. "Freedom," she whispered, the word escaping before she could stop it. "I would have wished for freedom." Something flickered in James's expression, an understanding that went deeper than mere sympathy. "Freedom is a precious thing," he said softly. "Not everyone who has it appreciates its value, and not everyone who wants it knows how to claim it." Their eyes met and held, and Isabella felt as if the world had narrowed down to just the two of them in that moment. The air seemed charged with electricity, like the moments before a summer storm. She was acutely aware of everything about him: the steady rhythm of his breathing, the strength in his hands as they rested on his knees, the way his gaze seemed to memorize every detail of her face. "My lady." The sharp voice of Mrs. Hawthorne cut through the spell like a blade. Both Isabella and James sprang to their feet, guilt written plainly across their faces as the housekeeper approached with her usual brisk efficiency. "Lord Thornfield has returned early from his business trip. He's asking for you in his study." Isabella's heart sank like a stone. Edmund had been away for a week, visiting his holdings in the north, and she had grown accustomed to the freedom his absence provided. The thought of returning to their cold, formal interactions felt suffocating after the warmth she had just experienced with James. "Of course," she managed, smoothing her skirts with hands that trembled slightly. "Thank you, Mrs. Hawthorne." As she turned to leave, James caught her eye one last time. "The secret heart of the garden," he said quietly so only she could hear. "It's not a place, my lady. It's a feeling. And once you find it, it changes everything." Isabella hurried back to the manor, her mind spinning with the implications of his words. As she made her way through the marble corridors toward Edmund's study, she felt as if she was returning to a life that no longer fit her properly, like a dress that had been made for someone else entirely. Edmund was standing behind his massive oak desk when she entered, sorting through a stack of correspondence with his usual methodical precision. He was a handsome man in his way, with silver hair and kind blue eyes, but there was something tired about him that made him seem older than his 55 years. "Isabella, my dear," he said, looking up with a smile that was genuine but distant. "I trust you've been well in my absence. Mrs. Hawthorne tells me the new gardener has been working miracles with the grounds." "Yes," Isabella replied, hoping her voice didn't betray the tumult of emotions James's presence had awakened in her. "Mr. Blackwood is very skilled." Edmund nodded approvingly. "Excellent. I've invited the Ashworths and several other families for a garden party next month. It will be good to show off the restored grounds." He paused, studying her with the detached interest he might show a valuable painting. "You look well, my dear. The summer air agrees with you." As Edmund continued talking about his business affairs and social obligations, Isabella found her thoughts drifting back to the fountain, to the way James had looked at her as if she were the most fascinating woman in the world. For a few precious moments she had felt truly seen and appreciated for who she was, not just what she represented. That night, as she lay in her lonely bed listening to the summer rain against her windows, Isabella stared out toward the cottage by the east gate. A single light glowed in one of the windows, and she wondered what James was thinking about as he settled into his new home. Was he thinking about their conversation by the fountain? Did he feel the same electric connection that had left her breathless and confused? The rain continued to fall, washing over the newly planted gardens and promising growth and renewal. In the darkness, Isabella made a decision that would change everything. Tomorrow she would find a way to see James again. Propriety be damned. The secret heart of the garden was calling to her, and she was finally ready to answer. The opportunity Isabella had been hoping for came sooner than expected. 2 days after Edmund's return, he announced that he would be spending the afternoon in the village, meeting with the local magistrate about a land dispute. As soon as his carriage disappeared down the tree-lined drive, Isabella felt her heart begin to race with anticipation. She had barely slept the night before, her mind filled with thoughts of James and the way he had looked at her by the fountain. The memory of his words about the secret heart of the garden haunted her dreams, filling her with a restless energy that made her feel more alive than she had in years. Isabella chose her outfit carefully, selecting a simple day dress of pale yellow muslin that brought out the golden flecks in her green eyes. She left her hair loose, allowing it to cascade over her shoulders in dark waves, and slipped out of the manor through the kitchen gardens where the servants wouldn't see her. The afternoon sun was warm on her face as she made her way toward the east side of the estate, following a winding path through the newly restored herb garden. The air was thick with the scent of lavender and rosemary, and she could hear the distant sound of someone working near the greenhouse. She found James in the old conservatory, a beautiful glass structure that had been neglected for years but was now sparkling clean and filled with exotic plants. He was carefully transplanting orchids, his large hands surprisingly gentle as he worked with the delicate flowers. Sunlight streamed through the glass panels, creating patterns of light and shadow that danced across his face and shoulders. "The conservatory looks beautiful," Isabella said softly, not wanting to startle him. James looked up, and she saw surprise and pleasure flicker across his features. "Lady Thornfield," he said, setting down his tools and straightening to face her. "I wasn't expecting. That is, I hope you don't mind my working in here. Lord Thornfield gave me permission to restore it." "I don't mind at all," Isabella assured him, stepping further into the warm, humid space. "I used to spend hours in here as a child. It was like having my own private jungle." She moved closer to examine the orchids he had been working with, their exotic blooms a riot of purple and white. "These are magnificent. Where did you learn so much about such rare plants?" James seemed to relax slightly at her genuine interest. I spent several years traveling before I came to England, he explained. I worked in botanical gardens and places most people only read about in books. I learned that beauty can grow anywhere, as long as someone cares enough to nurture it. There was something in his voice, a hint of sadness or regret, that made Isabella look at him more closely. What brought you back to England? She asked gently. For a moment, James seemed to struggle with whether to answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was quiet and careful. Sometimes a man makes mistakes that require him to start over somewhere new, he said. The question is whether he's brave enough to take that chance. Isabella felt her heart constrict with sympathy and curiosity. There was clearly more to James Blackwood than met the eye, layers of complexity that made him even more intriguing. I think starting over takes tremendous courage, she said softly. Most people are too afraid to leave behind what they know, even when it makes them unhappy. Their eyes met across the space between them, and Isabella felt that same electric connection that had sparked by the fountain. The air in the conservatory seemed to shimmer with possibility, heavy with the scent of blooming flowers and unspoken desires. What about you, Lady Thornfield? James asked, his voice rough with emotion. Are you happy with the life you've chosen? The question hit Isabella like a physical blow, forcing her to confront truths she had been avoiding for years. I didn't choose this life, she whispered, the words escaping before she could stop them. It was chosen for me. Sometimes I feel like I'm living someone else's story, playing a role that was written by other people. James took a step closer, and Isabella could see the compassion in his dark eyes. Then perhaps it's time to write your own story, he said quietly. The words hung between them, loaded with meaning and possibility. Isabella felt as if she was standing at the edge of a cliff, with safety behind her and an unknown but exhilarating future stretching out ahead. Her whole body seemed to vibrate with nervous energy, as she realized that James was offering her something she had never dared to dream of. I don't know how, she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. James reached out slowly, as if giving her time to pull away, and gently touched her hand. The contact sent lightning through her entire body, and she gasped at the intensity of the sensation. His skin was warm and rough from years of honest work, so different from the soft, pampered hands of the men in her social circle. You start with one choice, he said, his thumb tracing gentle circles on the back of her hand. One moment of courage, and then another, until courage becomes a habit instead of fear. Isabella stared down at their joined hands, amazed by how right it felt. For the first time in her adult life, she felt truly connected to another person, as if James could see straight through to her soul and accept everything he found there. James, she whispered, testing the feel of his name on her lips. It felt dangerous and wonderful at the same time. Isabella, he replied, and the way he said her name made it sound like music. They stood there in the dappled sunlight of the conservatory, hands joined and hearts racing, both knowing they were crossing a line that could never be uncrossed. Around them, the exotic flowers bloomed in riotous colors, as if nature itself was celebrating their connection. But even as Isabella lost herself in the warmth of James's touch and the promise in his eyes, a part of her mind remained aware of the risks they were taking. If they were discovered, the consequences would be devastating. James would lose his position and his reputation, while she would face social ruin and Edmund's wrath. Yet as she looked into James's face and saw her own longing reflected there, Isabella realized that some things were worth any risk. For the first time in years, she felt truly alive, and she wasn't ready to give that feeling up without exploring where it might lead. The sound of carriage wheels on gravel in the distance broke the spell, and both of them froze. Edmund was returning earlier than expected, and they were dangerously exposed in the glass conservatory. You should go, James said urgently, though his hand tightened on hers as if he couldn't bear to let her leave. Isabella nodded, knowing he was right but feeling as if she was tearing away a part of herself. When can I see you again? She asked desperately. Tomorrow night, James said quickly. After midnight. Meet me in the rose garden by the old sundial. We need to talk properly away from prying eyes. Isabella squeezed his hand once more, memorizing the feel of his skin against hers, before hurrying back toward the manor. Her heart was pounding with a mixture of fear and exhilaration, as she slipped back into the house just moments before Edmund's carriage pulled up to the front entrance. That evening, as she sat through dinner with her husband, making polite conversation about his business affairs, Isabella's mind was entirely focused on the promise of tomorrow night. She had taken the first step toward writing her own story, and there was no turning back now. The next day passed with agonizing slowness for Isabella. Every minute felt like an hour as she went through the motions of her daily routine, her mind constantly drifting to thoughts of the midnight meeting with James. She found herself unable to concentrate on anything, jumping at every sound, and checking the clock so frequently that Mrs. Hawthorne asked if she was feeling unwell. Edmund noticed her distraction during dinner, commenting that she seemed unusually quiet. Isabella forced herself to make conversation about the upcoming garden party and the restoration work, all while her heart hammered against her ribs with anticipation and nervousness. When Edmund finally retired to his study with his evening brandy and business papers, Isabella pleaded a headache and went to her chambers early. She dismissed her lady's maid, claiming she wanted to rest, then spent the evening pacing her room like a caged bird, watching the hands of her mantel clock crawl toward midnight. As the appointed hour approached, Isabella wrapped herself in a dark cloak and slipped out of the manor through the servants' entrance. The night was clear and warm, with a full moon casting silver light across the garden paths. Every shadow seemed to hold potential danger, and every sound made her heart skip a beat, but she pressed forward with determination born of desperation. The rose garden was transformed in the moonlight, the white blooms glowing like stars against the dark foliage. The old sundial stood at the center, its bronze face gleaming in the pale light. Isabella had played around this sundial as a child, never imagining that one day it would be the site of the most important meeting of her life. James was already waiting when she arrived, his tall figure silhouetted against the climbing roses that covered the garden's back wall. He turned at the sound of her footsteps, and even in the dim light, she could see the relief that crossed his features. "I wasn't sure you would come," he said softly, his voice carrying clearly in the still night air. "I wasn't sure either," Isabella admitted, pulling her cloak more tightly around herself. "But I couldn't stay away. I've been thinking about what you said, about writing my own story, and I realized that for the first time in my life, I want to try." James stepped closer, and in the moonlight, Isabella could see the conflict written plainly across his handsome features. "Isabella," he said, her name a caress on his lips. "Before this goes any further, there are things you need to know about me, things that might change how you feel." Isabella's heart clenched with sudden fear. "What things?" James ran a hand through his dark hair, clearly struggling with how to begin. "My real name is James Blackwood, that much is true. But I'm not just a gardener, and I didn't come to Ravenshollow Manor by chance." He paused, seeming to gather his courage. "I'm the second son of the Earl of Wessington. I was meant to marry well and live a life of privilege just like your husband. But I fell in love with someone I couldn't have, and when that relationship was discovered, it caused a scandal that ruined lives." Isabella felt the blood drain from her face as the implications of his words sank in. "You were married?" "No," James said quickly, seeing her distress. "But she was. Lady Catherine Ashworth was married to a man old enough to be her father, trapped in the same kind of loveless arrangement that you know all too well. We tried to be discreet, but when her husband discovered our affair, he challenged me to a duel." Isabella's hand flew to her throat as she imagined the horror of such a situation. Dueling was illegal but still practiced among the aristocracy, and the consequences could be deadly. "I couldn't bring myself to shoot him," James continued, his voice heavy with old pain. "He was a cruel man who had made Catherine's life miserable, but killing him wouldn't have solved anything. So I fired into the air, and he didn't." James touched his left shoulder unconsciously, and Isabella realized he carried a scar from that terrible day. "What happened to Lady Catherine?" Isabella whispered, though she dreaded the answer. "Her husband sent her away to a convent in Ireland where she died of fever 6 months later." James's voice broke slightly on the words. "I fled England that same night, spending 3 years traveling the world and trying to forget. When I heard she was gone, I came back, but I couldn't return to my old life. So I became what I am now, a gardener who tends to growing things because he couldn't protect the most precious flower in his own life." Isabella stood in stunned silence, her mind reeling with everything James had revealed. She could see the pain in his eyes, the guilt that still ate at him after all these years. But she could also see something else, something that made her heart soar even as her rational mind screamed warnings. "Why are you telling me this?" she asked quietly. Because I won't make the same mistake twice, James said fiercely. I won't let you risk everything without knowing exactly what kind of man you're dealing with. I've brought ruin on one innocent woman, and I won't do it again no matter how much you what? Isabella prompted when he trailed off. James looked at her with such intensity that she felt her knees go weak. How much I've come to care for you, he admitted. In just a few days you've awakened feelings in me that I thought died with Catherine. But I can't ask you to throw away your life for a man with my history. Isabella felt tears prick her eyes, but they weren't tears of sadness. They were tears of recognition, of finally understanding that she wasn't alone in the feelings that had been tormenting her. James cared for her, truly cared for her in a way that Edmund never had and never would. Don't you think that should be my decision to make? She asked, stepping closer to him. You've been honest with me about your past. Now let me be honest about my present. My marriage to Edmund is a business arrangement, nothing more. He treats me kindly but distantly, like a valuable possession he's proud to own but doesn't particularly want to spend time with. I've been dying slowly in that house, James, suffocating under the weight of a life that was never really mine. James reached out as if to touch her face, then stopped himself. Isabella, if we're discovered, then we'll face the consequences together, she said firmly, catching his hand and pressing it to her cheek. I'm tired of living in fear, James. I'm tired of being safe and miserable when I could be taking a chance on something real. The touch of his hand against her skin sent fire racing through her veins, and she saw her own desire reflected in his dark eyes. The moonlight painted everything in silver and shadow, making the moment feel like something from a dream. Are you sure? James whispered, his thumb tracing the line of her cheekbone. Once we cross this line, there's no going back. I've never been more sure of anything in my life, Isabella replied, and she meant every word. James pulled her into his arms then, and when his lips met hers, Isabella felt as if the world tilted on its axis. The kiss was gentle at first, tentative and sweet, but as Isabella responded, it deepened into something passionate and desperate. She had never been kissed like this before, with such hunger and tenderness combined, and she understood now why poets wrote of love as if it were a force of nature. When they finally broke apart, both were breathing heavily, their foreheads pressed together as they tried to process what had just happened between them. What do we do now? Isabella whispered, her hands still tangled in James's shirt. Now we're very, very careful, James replied, his voice rough with emotion, and we find a way to be together without destroying both our lives in the process. As they stood there in the moonlit garden, holding each other close, both Isabella and James knew that they had just changed the course of their destinies forever. The path ahead would be dangerous and uncertain, but for the first time in years, Isabella felt truly alive. She had found the secret heart of the garden at last, and it was beating in perfect rhythm with her own. The weeks that followed their moonlit confession were a delicate dance of stolen moments and carefully orchestrated meetings. Isabella and James developed an intricate system of signals and secret messages, using the language of flowers to communicate when it was safe to meet and when danger lurked too close. Isabella would leave specific blooms on her windowsill each morning, visible from the gardens below. A white rose meant the coast was clear for an afternoon encounter, while red roses warned of Edmund's presence or suspicious servants. James would respond by arranging his tools in certain patterns or leaving flowers of his own in predetermined locations throughout the estate. Their favorite meeting place became the old folly at the far end of the estate, a crumbling stone structure overgrown with ivy that had been built by Edmund's grandfather as a romantic gesture for his wife. It was hidden from view of the main house and rarely visited by anyone except the occasional groundskeeper. Isabella would slip away during her afternoon walks, claiming she needed solitude to sketch or read, while James would arrive separately under the pretense of checking the boundary fences. Inside the folly, surrounded by tumbling roses and wild honeysuckle, they created their own private world. They would talk for hours about everything and nothing, sharing their dreams, fears, and the small details of their daily lives that somehow seemed precious when spoken to someone who truly cared. James told her about the exotic places he had traveled and the wonders he had seen, while Isabella shared her love of literature and her secret ambition to write poetry. But it wasn't just conversation that drew them together. The physical attraction between them was undeniable and growing stronger with each stolen encounter. James would trace the lines of Isabella's face with gentle fingers, memorizing every detail as if he were afraid she might disappear. Isabella found herself studying the way sunlight caught in his dark hair, and the way his eyes crinkled when he smiled, storing up these precious images against the loneliness of her nights in the manor. Their first real kiss had opened a floodgate of desire that both thrilled and terrified them. Each subsequent meeting grew more passionate, more dangerous, as they struggled to maintain the careful boundaries they had set for themselves. Isabella had never experienced anything like the fire that James awakened in her, and she found herself taking increasingly bold risks just to spend a few more minutes in his arms. The danger of discovery was always present, adding an edge of excitement to their meetings that made every touch electric. They had several close calls that left them both shaking with a mixture of fear and adrenaline. Once Mrs. Hawthorne had nearly caught Isabella returning from the folly, with grass stains on her dress and flowers in her hair. Another time, one of the stable boys had seen James heading toward the boundary fence at an unusual hour and had mentioned it to the head groom. But perhaps the most dangerous moment came during the garden party that Edmund had been planning. The estate was filled with guests from the finest families in the county, all eager to see the restored gardens and enjoy the Thornfields' famous hospitality. Isabella played the perfect hostess, dressed in a gown of deep blue silk that Edmund had commissioned especially for the occasion. Her dark hair elaborately arranged and adorned with pearls that had belonged to his mother. James had worked tirelessly to prepare the gardens for the event, and they had never looked more beautiful. The roses were in full bloom, the lawns were perfectly manicured, and the restored fountain sparkled in the afternoon sunlight. Guests wandered the paths in small groups, praising the transformation and complimenting Edmund on his excellent choice of gardener. Throughout the afternoon, Isabella was acutely aware of James's presence as he moved discreetly through the gardens, ensuring that everything remained perfect for the guests. She caught glimpses of him from the corner of her eye, and each time their gazes met across the crowd, she felt her pulse quicken with a mixture of longing and apprehension. The crisis came when Lady Margaret Ashworth, a sharp-eyed woman known for her love of gossip, noticed the way Isabella's attention seemed to drift toward the garden's head gardener. "My dear Isabella," Lady Margaret said with false sweetness, approaching during a lull in the conversation, "you seem quite distracted today. I couldn't help but notice how often your gaze wanders to that handsome gardener of yours. Such a striking man, don't you think? Quite different from the usual run of servants." Isabella felt her blood turn to ice, but years of social training came to her rescue. "Mr. Blackwood has done exceptional work with the gardens," she replied smoothly, her voice betraying nothing of the panic racing through her veins. "Edmund and I are naturally pleased with the results of his efforts." "Oh, naturally," Lady Margaret agreed, but there was a calculating gleam in her eyes that made Isabella's stomach churn. "Still, one must be careful with such attractive help. You know how servants can sometimes develop inappropriate feelings for their betters. Why, I remember a dreadful scandal involving the Pemberton family and their music teacher just last season." The pointed warning was clear, and Isabella realized with growing horror that Lady Margaret suspected something. The older woman was known for her ability to sniff out scandal like a bloodhound, and she clearly sensed that there was more to Isabella's interest in the gardener than mere professional appreciation. "Of course," Isabella managed, forcing a laugh that sounded natural despite the terror clawing at her throat, "though I confess I'm far more interested in the roses than the man who tends them. Speaking of which, have you seen the new white climbing variety near the conservatory? Edmund had them imported specially from France." Lady Margaret allowed herself to be distracted by talk of flowers, but Isabella could feel the woman's suspicious gaze following her for the rest of the afternoon. Every smile felt forced, every laugh hollow, as she played her role as the perfect hostess while internally screaming with fear and frustration. The worst moment came when Edmund, flush with pride over the success of his party, called for everyone's attention to formally thank James for his work on the gardens. James was summoned from his discreet position near the greenhouse, looking uncomfortable as he found himself the center of attention among the assembled nobility. "Ladies and gentlemen," Edmund announced, his voice carrying across the garden, "I believe we should all thank Mr. Blackwood for the magnificent transformation you see before you. In just a few short weeks he has restored these gardens to their former glory and beyond." Polite applause rippled through the crowd, and Isabella was forced to clap along with everyone else, her heart breaking as she watched James accept the praise with quiet dignity. He looked so handsome in his best clothes, his dark hair neatly combed and his face clean-shaven for the occasion. She wanted nothing more than to rush to his side and claim him as her own, to tell the world that this remarkable man had captured her heart completely. Instead, she stood frozen beside her husband, playing the role of the dutiful wife while the man she loved was treated as nothing more than a skilled servant. The injustice of it all made her want to scream, but she forced herself to maintain her composure, knowing that any display of emotion would only feed Lady Margaret's suspicions. As the afternoon wore on, Isabella found herself growing more and more desperate for the party to end. The strain of pretending indifference to James while every fiber of her being longed to be near him was almost unbearable. By the time the last guest departed and the evening shadows began to lengthen, she felt as though she had aged years in a single day. That night, after Edmund had retired to his study with his usual brandy and congratulations from his friends still ringing in his ears, Isabella slipped out to meet James at their usual spot in the Folly. She found him waiting for her in the darkness, his face grave with concern. "We have a problem," she said without preamble, throwing herself into his arms with desperate relief. "Lady Margaret suspects something. She was asking pointed questions about you today, and I could see the wheels turning in her mind." James held her tightly, his face grim as he processed this information. "I noticed her watching us," he admitted. "She's dangerous, Isabella. Women like that thrive on destroying others with their gossip and speculation." "What are we going to do?" Isabella asked, her voice muffled against his chest. "If she spreads rumors, Edmund will have no choice but to investigate. And if he discovers the truth, then we'll have to be even more careful," James said firmly, tilting her chin up so he could look into her eyes. "Or we'll have to make a choice that will change everything." Isabella stared at him, her heart pounding as she understood the implication of his words. "What kind of choice?" James was quiet for a long moment, his hands gentle as they framed her face. "We could leave," he said finally. "Tonight, if necessary. I have some money saved, enough to get us to Scotland or Ireland where we could start fresh. You could obtain a divorce eventually, scandalous as it would be. We could build a life together away from all this." The proposal hung between them like a lifeline and a sword simultaneously. Isabella felt her heart soar at the thought of freedom, of a life where she could be herself completely and love James openly. But she also knew the harsh reality of what such a choice would mean. "I would lose everything," she whispered. "My family would disown me, society would shun me, and Edmund would never forgive the humiliation. We would be outcasts, struggling to survive while everyone we once knew turned their backs on us." "I know," James said quietly. "I'm not asking you to decide tonight. I'm just telling you that the option exists if things become impossible here." Isabella closed her eyes, overwhelmed by the magnitude of the decision that might soon be forced upon her. She had spent her entire life living within the bounds of propriety and expectation, never imagining that she would one day be contemplating such a dramatic rebellion against everything she had been taught to value. But as she stood there in James's arms, feeling more alive and real than she had in years, Isabella realized that some things were worth any sacrifice. The question was whether she had the courage to seize them when the moment came. The following weeks passed in a haze of mounting tension and barely concealed desperation. Lady Margaret's suspicions had planted a seed of fear that grew stronger with each passing day, making every stolen moment between Isabella and James feel like it might be their last. They continued to meet, but their encounters were shadowed by the knowledge that discovery could come at any moment. Isabella found herself jumping at every unexpected sound, scrutinizing the faces of the servants for signs of suspicion, and lying awake at night imagining worst-case scenarios. The strain was beginning to show in her appearance, despite her best efforts to maintain her usual composure. Dark circles appeared under her eyes, and she lost weight from the constant anxiety that churned in her stomach. Edmund, absorbed in his business affairs and pleased with the success of the garden party, remained oblivious to his wife's distress. He commented once that she seemed tired and suggested she might benefit from a visit to Bath for the waters, but Isabella quickly dismissed the idea, unable to bear the thought of being separated from James even temporarily. The breaking point came on a particularly humid afternoon, in late July. Isabella had arranged to meet James in the conservatory during Edmund's weekly ride to inspect the tenant farms. But as she made her way through the garden paths, she noticed Mrs. Hawthorne following at a discreet distance. The housekeeper's presence sent alarm bells ringing through Isabella's mind, but she was too close to the conservatory to turn back without appearing suspicious. James was waiting for her among the exotic flowers, his face lighting up at the sight of her before quickly darkening as he noticed her obvious distress. "What's wrong?" he asked immediately, reaching for her hands. "Mrs. Hawthorne followed me," Isabella whispered urgently. "I think she suspects something. We need to be very careful." But even as the words left her lips, Isabella heard the soft crunch of footsteps on the gravel path outside the conservatory. Through the glass panel, she could see Mrs. Hawthorne approaching with deliberate purpose, her expression grim and determined. "She's coming," James said quietly, his hands dropping away from Isabella's as they both struggled to arrange themselves in appropriately innocent positions. Mrs. Hawthorne entered the conservatory with her usual brisk efficiency, but her sharp eyes missed nothing as they took in the scene before her. Isabella was examining a display of tropical ferns while James stood at a respectful distance, ostensibly explaining their care requirements. To a casual observer, it might have appeared perfectly innocent, but Mrs. Hawthorne was far from casual in her observations. "Lady Thornfield," the housekeeper said with cool politeness. "Lord Thornfield has returned early from his inspection. He's asking for you in his study." Isabella's blood turned to ice. Edmund never returned early from his weekly rounds, which typically lasted most of the afternoon. "Did he say what he wanted?" She managed, her voice admirably steady despite the panic racing through her veins. "He didn't elaborate," Mrs. Hawthorne replied, but there was something in her tone that made Isabella's skin crawl with foreboding. "He seemed quite eager to speak with you, however." As Isabella hurried back to the manor, her mind raced through possibilities, each more terrifying than the last. Had Edmund somehow discovered their affair? Had Lady Margaret's gossip reached his ears? Or was this simply an unfortunate coincidence that her guilty conscience was magnifying out of proportion? She found Edmund in his study, standing behind his massive desk with his back to the door, staring out the window that overlooked the gardens. His posture was rigid with tension, and Isabella felt her heart sink as she realized that this was not a casual summons. "You wanted to see me?" she said carefully, closing the door behind her. Edmund turned slowly, and Isabella was shocked by the expression on his face. Gone was his usual mild, distant demeanor, replaced by something cold and dangerous that she had never seen before. In his hand he held a single white rose, its petals slightly crushed as if it had been gripped too tightly. "Do you recognize this?" he asked quietly, his voice deceptively calm. Isabella's mouth went dry as she stared at the flower. It was one of the roses she had been leaving on her windowsill as a signal to James. But how had Edmund come to possess it? "It's a rose," she said weakly, knowing how inadequate the response sounded even as the words left her lips. "Indeed," Edmund agreed, his blue eyes never leaving her face. "A white rose, to be specific. Mrs. Hawthorne brought it to my attention, along with some rather interesting observations about your recent behavior." The room seemed to tilt around Isabella as she realized the full extent of her predicament. Mrs. Hawthorne had been watching, noting the flowers on the windowsill, tracking her movements through the gardens, and reporting everything back to Edmund. The loyal housekeeper's first allegiance had always been to the master of the house, not his wife. "Edmund, I can explain," Isabella began, but he held up a hand to silence her. "Can you?" he asked, his voice still unnaturally calm. "Can you explain why you've been leaving flowers on your windowsill in what appears to be some sort of signal system? Can you explain why you've been taking long, solitary walks that somehow always lead you to areas where our head gardener happens to be working? Can you explain the way you look at him, Isabella, as if he's the answer to all your prayers?" Each question hit Isabella like a physical blow, stripping away her defenses and leaving her exposed and vulnerable. She opened her mouth to deny everything, to construct some plausible explanation that might save them all. But the words died in her throat as she saw the knowledge in Edmund's eyes. He knew. Perhaps not all the details, but he knew enough. "How long?" Edmund asked when her silence stretched too long. "Edmund, please," Isabella whispered, tears beginning to spill down her cheeks. "It's not what you think." "How long, Isabella?" He repeated, his voice harder now, the careful control beginning to crack. "Nothing has happened," she said desperately. "We've talked, yes, but nothing inappropriate has occurred. I swear to you, Edmund, on my honor as your wife." Edmund studied her face for a long moment, and Isabella held her breath, hoping against hope that he might believe her partial truth. But then his expression hardened further, and she knew that her denials were useless. "Perhaps not yet," he said finally. "But it would have, wouldn't it? Given time and opportunity, you would have betrayed your marriage vows completely." Isabella couldn't deny the truth of his words, and her silence was answer enough. She stood before her husband, tears streaming down her face, knowing that her life as she had known it was about to end. "I want him gone," Edmund said quietly, his voice carrying the weight of absolute authority. "Tonight. He's to pack his belongings and leave the estate immediately. I'll provide references for his gardening skills, but he's never to set foot on Thornfield property again." "No," Isabella gasped, the word torn from her throat before she could stop it. "Please, Edmund, don't punish him for my failings. If you must blame someone, blame me." Edmund's laugh was bitter and cold. "Oh, my dear wife, you'll face your own consequences soon enough. But first the gardener goes, and you, Isabella, will watch from your window as he leaves, so there can be no doubt in your mind that this chapter of your life is closed forever." As the full weight of Edmund's pronouncement settled over her, Isabella felt something inside her chest break open like a dam bursting. The careful life she had built, the tentative happiness she had found with James, the future she had begun to dream of, all of it was crumbling around her like a house built on sand. But even as despair threatened to overwhelm her, a spark of defiance flickered to life in Isabella's heart. Edmund could force James to leave, but he couldn't control what happened after that. The choice James had offered her weeks ago suddenly seemed less like a fantasy and more like the only path to salvation. As Edmund turned back to his window, dismissing her with the gesture, Isabella quietly slipped from the room. Her mind was racing with desperate plans and half-formed schemes. But one thing was crystal clear. She would not let James leave alone, and she would not spend the rest of her life as a prisoner in her own home. The time for careful consideration was over. Tonight, she would have to choose between the safe misery of her current life and the uncertain promise of freedom. And for the first time since this nightmare began, Isabella knew exactly what her choice would be. The hours that followed Edmund's ultimatum passed in a blur of frantic preparation and desperate planning. Isabella returned to her chambers, her mind racing as she tried to formulate a plan that would allow her to escape with James before dawn. She knew that Edmund would waste no time in carrying out his threat, and every moment of delay increased the risk of losing James forever. From her window, she could see lights burning in the cottage by the east gate, and she knew that James was likely packing his belongings, preparing to leave the estate and disappear from her life as suddenly as he had entered it. The thought filled her with such despair that she had to grip the windowsill to keep from collapsing. But despair quickly gave way to determination. Isabella had spent her entire life being moved around like a chess piece in other people's games, married off to suit her family's ambitions, and molded to fit Edmund's idea of the perfect wife. For once she was going to make her own choice regardless of the consequences. Moving with quiet efficiency, Isabella began to gather the few precious belongings she couldn't bear to leave behind. Her mother's jewelry, hidden away in a secret compartment of her jewelry box, a small bundle of letters from her sister in France, a miniature portrait of her parents painted just before their deaths. Everything else, the gowns and furniture and symbols of her privileged life, she would gladly abandon for a chance at real happiness. She dressed carefully in her most practical traveling dress, a simple garment of dark blue wool that would serve her well on the road. Over it, she donned her warmest cloak, knowing that the nights would be cold as they traveled north toward Scotland and the promise of a new life. As the clock struck 11, Isabella heard the sound of a carriage being prepared in the courtyard below. Edmund was wasting no time in arranging James's departure. Probably wanting to see him gone before morning brought the risk of gossip among the servants. The sight of the carriage filled Isabella with fresh urgency, and she quickly finished her preparations. But before she could leave her chambers, there was a soft knock at her door. Isabella's heart leaped into her throat, thinking it might be Edmund coming to ensure she witnessed James's departure as he had promised. Instead, Mrs. Hawthorne entered, her expression unreadable in the dim candlelight. "My lady," the housekeeper said quietly, closing the door behind her. I thought you should know that Mr. Blackwood has asked to speak with you before he leaves. He's waiting in the rose garden by the sundial." Isabella stared at the older woman, trying to read her intentions. Mrs. Hawthorne had been the one to report their suspicious behavior to Edmund, but there was something in her manner now that suggested regret or perhaps even sympathy. "Why are you telling me this?" Isabella asked carefully. Mrs. Hawthorne was quiet for a moment, her weathered hands clasped tightly in front of her. "I've served this family for 30 years, she said finally. "I've watched Lord Thornfield through 2 marriages, and I've seen how lonely this house can be for a woman with a passionate heart. I reported what I saw because it was my duty, but that doesn't mean I take pleasure in the consequences." The admission hung in the air between them, and Isabella felt a rush of gratitude toward the woman who had unknowingly given her the opportunity she needed. "How long do I have?" Isabella asked. "The carriage will depart at midnight," Mrs. Hawthorne replied. "Lord Thornfield has retired to his study and likely won't emerge for hours. The other servants are in their quarters, and I'll ensure they remain there." Isabella nodded, understanding that Mrs. Hawthorne was offering her a chance to say goodbye to James, though the housekeeper couldn't know that Isabella had no intention of letting it be a farewell. "Thank you," Isabella whispered, and meant it with all her heart. Mrs. Hawthorne nodded once, then slipped back out into the corridor, leaving Isabella alone with her racing thoughts and pounding heart. The rose garden was bathed in silver moonlight when Isabella arrived, her feet silent on the familiar paths she had walked so many times before. James was waiting by the sundial, a small travel bag at his feet, and his face etched with the same despair that had been tearing at Isabella's heart all evening. "Isabella," he said softly as she approached, his voice thick with emotion. "I'm so sorry. I never meant for this to happen. Never meant to bring such trouble into your life." "Don't apologize," Isabella said fiercely, throwing herself into his arms with desperate relief. "None of this is your fault. If anything, I should be thanking you for showing me what it means to truly live." James held her tightly, his face buried in her dark hair as if he were trying to memorize her scent. "What will happen to you now?" he asked quietly. "That depends," Isabella said, pulling back to look into his eyes. "Do you still have that money you mentioned?" "Enough to get us to Scotland?" James went very still, his dark eyes searching her face in the moonlight. "Isabella, what are you saying?" "I'm saying that I've made my choice," she replied, her voice steady despite the magnitude of what she was proposing. "I won't let you leave alone, and I won't spend the rest of my life regretting what might have been. If you'll have me, if you're willing to face an uncertain future with a scandalous woman who's about to abandon her marriage, then I want to come with you." For a moment, James seemed unable to speak, his face cycling through disbelief, hope and fear in rapid succession. "Isabella, do you understand what you're saying? There will be no going back from this. Once you leave with me, you'll be branded an adulteress and a social outcast. Your family will disown you, society will shun you, and Edmund will make sure your reputation is destroyed completely." "I know all of that," Isabella said calmly. "I've thought of nothing else for the past few hours, but I've also thought about what my life will be like if I stay. Edmund will never trust me again, never let me forget this betrayal. I'll live under constant suspicion and surveillance, growing old and bitter in a house that feels more like a prison every day. That's not living, James. That's just existing." James cupped her face in his hands, his thumbs tracing the tracks of tears she didn't realize she had been shedding. "Are you absolutely certain? Because once we leave together, I'll never let you go again. I'll spend the rest of my life making sure you never regret choosing love over security." "I've never been more certain of anything," Isabella replied, and she meant every word. "I'd rather face an uncertain future with you than a certain misery without you." James kissed her then, with a passion that spoke of desperation and hope and love so fierce it took her breath away. When they finally broke apart, both were trembling with the magnitude of the step they were about to take. "The carriage will take me to the village inn," James said urgently. "Can you meet me there?" "There's a mail coach that leaves for the north at dawn." Isabella nodded, her heart racing with excitement and terror. "Give me an hour to gather a few things and slip away from the house. I'll meet you at the inn, and we'll leave together." They kissed once more, sealing their pact with all the tenderness and passion they had been forced to keep hidden for so long. Then James picked up his bag and walked away into the darkness, heading toward the carriage that would take him to the village and the beginning of their new life together. Isabella stood alone in the rose garden for a moment, surrounded by the flowers that had witnessed the beginning of their love story. Then she turned and walked back toward the manor, where she would collect her belongings and say goodbye to the only life she had ever known. As she slipped through the darkened corridors toward her chambers, Isabella felt a sense of peace settle over her that she hadn't experienced in years. She was finally taking control of her own destiny, choosing love over duty and happiness over security. The path ahead would be difficult and uncertain, but she would face it with James by her side, and that made any sacrifice worthwhile. By dawn, Lady Isabella Thornfield would be gone, leaving behind only a letter explaining her choice and a white rose on her pillow, a final symbol of the love that had transformed her from a trapped, unhappy woman into someone brave enough to claim her own happiness. In the village inn, James waited with growing hope and anticipation, knowing that when the sun rose, he would finally be able to love Isabella openly and completely, without shame or secrecy. Their real life together was about to begin, and despite all the challenges that lay ahead, neither of them had ever felt more alive or more certain that they had made the right choice. The secret garden had given up its greatest treasure at last, not in the form of magical flowers or hidden gold, but in the powerful truth that love, when it is real and true, is worth any risk and any sacrifice. As Isabella gathered her few precious belongings and prepared to step into an uncertain but hopeful future, she finally understood what the secret heart of the garden had been trying to tell her all along. Sometimes the greatest courage lies not in staying safe, but in daring to bloom where love plants you regardless of the consequences.